2019 was a pretty good year for reading for me. I read 21 books. So in this video, I'm just going to list the books I read and say a few things about the ones that I liked the most, the ones that I liked the least, and give you some recommendations if you're trying to get into reading or if you're just looking to add more things to your list of books that you have to read. My list is really long. Before I do that, how do I decide what book I'm going to read next? Usually somebody who I'm close with, or I share similar tastes in books with, or somebody who I trust or look up to, or somebody who is teaching me interesting things. Whatever book they suggest to me, I usually write it down and add it to my list. If I'm on the internet and maybe watching videos, maybe on Reddit or doing whatever, if I see certain books come up a lot, usually after time I'm like, okay, these probably seem good enough or culturally important enough to make it onto my list. So I develop a reading list, and those are the things that I would like to read eventually. But then from there, the rest is really up to my public library. I live 2 blocks away from our library. Every couple of weeks I go there and pick up like 2 or 3 more books. And whenever I'm there, I just go semi-randomly through my reading list, because a lot of the times the ones I want to read are on hold or they're checked out. So basically whatever the library's got at that moment is what I'm going to read. And some books my library just doesn't have. So at some point in time, I'm going to have to make a concerted effort to buy them, look elsewhere for free versions of them, get them as a gift maybe. And speaking of gifts, some books aren't on my list at all, and I just get given them for Christmas or something by like my dad, and then I read them because they're sitting in my bedroom for 2 years, and then I finally think, whatever. And sometimes those books are ones I really like, and sometimes they're just okay. Another factor that goes into which books I choose from the library is the genre or style they are. I typically like to read a fiction and then a nonfiction, and a fiction and a nonfiction, or some pattern close to that. So every time I go to the library, I might get 2 to 3 books. I'll at least get 1 nonfiction and 1 fiction, and then the third one depends on how I'm feeling. So, what books have I read this year? Let's pull up my phone because I keep a list so I remember. The first book I finished reading this year is Waking Up by Sam Harris. Actually, I started reading that one in 2018, but the date that I finished the book was 2019. And that book is about consciousness, mindfulness, meditation. Really, one of the reasons that I read that book is because that was kind of a point in time where the idea of meditation was kind of losing its mystical woo-hoo bullshit definition that I had always pictured it as in my head, and it was actually gaining some sort of practical, realistic, commonplace, normal word, and I wanted to learn more about meditation and that sort of thing. The Wise Man's Fear by Patrick Rothfuss. Just at the end of 2018, I had read The Name of the Wind. This is the sequel to that book. It's a fantasy series, incomplete right now. The Checklist Manifesto, a nonfiction book about how powerful and useful checklists are. It was a pretty small book and an interesting read. Magnus Chase and the Gods of Asgard, The Sword of Summer. When I was younger, I had read all the Percy Jackson books, and I figured, I like that author, I like Norse mythology, I'll read those books too. On Writing, a Memoir of the Craft by Stephen King. That's actually the only Stephen King book I've read. I'd like to read more Stephen King, his actual novels, but that one I read because I'm really interested in writing. Fire and Blood by George R. Martin. If you're interested in A Song of Ice and Fire, because of course you wouldn't be interested in A Game of Thrones, and if you've read them, read those first. And if you want to read more, well then read A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms first. But if you want to read more, then probably read The World of Ice and Fire first. But then if you want to read more, like I do, then maybe read this one. It's about a bunch of Targaryen kings. Then I read Magnus Chase and the Gods of Asgard, The Hammer of Thor. It's the sequel in that series. I actually haven't read the 3rd book yet. The Humans by Matt Haig, whatever. That book I consumed in 3 days. The Elements of Style. Once again, read this because I'm interested in writing and how to be a good writer. The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins. That's one of the most influential books in biology. Then I read Dune. I didn't read that one because I'm super into sci-fi or have even seen any of the Dune movies or whatever. I just read Dune because it's an important book. Basically Star Wars is ripped off from it. People always make references to it and talk about how great it is, so I figured I'd see how great it is for myself. 21 Lessons for the 21st Century by Yuval Noah Harari. Yuval Noah Harari I had listened to before in some podcasts he was on and speeches he gave, and he had some really interesting stuff to say, so I looked into his books and read one of them. I'm planning on reading the other ones. I just haven't yet. Before the Storm. This one was an audiobook. I did a free trial of Audible and just got this book with it. If you're not into the universe of Warcraft, then don't read it. 12 Rules for Life by Jordan Peterson. Lots of people kind of equate Jordan Peterson with like the alt-right, and a lot of his fan base might be right-wing, but there's a lot of what he talks about that is just good advice all around, especially when he's talking about the stuff like self-help, which is what this book is. Theodore's Heirs. This was one of the books that I had got as a gift from my dad and was sitting in my bedroom for a year that I mentioned. How to Change Your Mind by Michael Pollan. This book is about psychedelics and the science of psychedelics, and also how it's kind of making a comeback now. Norse Mythology by Neil Gaiman. I've read some other Neil Gaiman before, and this one's pretty different. It's more like it could be a children's book, but really it's just like simple short stories about Norse mythology. Not even he came up with them, he just adapted them. The Three-Body Problem. This is a bestseller in China, translated into English. It's the first book in a sci-fi trilogy. I haven't read the rest of the trilogy yet, but I plan on it. The only problem is that the latter two books aren't at my public library. Murder on the Orient Express by Agatha Christie. That name is probably familiar to you because it's been made into a movie like twice, and it's a really popular murder mystery. I guess Agatha Christie is the most published author in existence, aside from Shakespeare. And this one I technically finished in 2020, just a few days ago, but I read the bulk of it in 2019, so maybe I'll just count it as being in 2019. But Silent Spring. It was written in the 60s, it kind of sparked the environmental movement, and it's about how pesticides are just destroying the world. So on this list, you may have noticed two giant gaps in the timeline. No, it didn't take me 2 months to read Dune. There was actually two books that I started in 2019 but didn't finish. The reason for that is these books were so big that I actually didn't have the time to finish them before I had to return them to the library. And then when I returned them to the library, somebody else was on the waiting list for them, so I couldn't just get them right back. At some point in time, I'm going to have to go back to the library and get those books again and pick up from where I left off. But the first book that I didn't finish was Shogun. It's like a realistic fiction based in like 1600s Japan or something like that. It's a gigantic book, really in-depth look at Japanese culture at the time, and I hear that it's pretty historically accurate as far as the details of what a samurai lifestyle is like goes. I was really enjoying that book. I got like 250 pages in. It's just I had like 500 more pages to go, so I returned it and got Dune. The second large chunk, no, it didn't take me 2 months to read 12 Rules for Life. That's actually a pretty short, quick book. But before then, I was reading The Better Angels of Our Nature by Steven Pinker. That is a mammoth of a book too, and it's nonfiction. And nonfiction books always take me longer because, you know, there's like no plots, they're more information dense. So the pages per minute or the amount of time that I can manage to sit down and read it for are much lower. It's already going to take me longer compared to a fiction book of the same size, and it's huge. So I got also like 250 pages into that one and had to return it to the library. It was filled with a lot of really interesting information though, so I feel like even though I didn't finish it yet, I still did learn a lot from it. Alright, so what are my top 3 fiction books that I read last year? Top 3, no particular order. The Humans. This is about an alien who takes the place of a human on Earth and has to learn everything about human life through strangers' eyes. It's really funny and compelling, and it's filled with so many insights of just pure wisdom. I highly recommend anybody read that, even if you're not into sci-fi at all. It's not heavy sci-fi, and it's a small book, so give it a shot. The Wise Man's Fear. Patrick Rothfuss is a really good writer. The Name of the Wind might be my favorite fantasy book. It's a tough call, but The Wise Man's Fear also really great. Obviously, don't just read that book, it's a sequel. But if you are into fantasy at all, I highly recommend that you check out The Name of the Wind. But I'll give you a picture of what that's about generally. The main character is Kvothe. He's telling the story of his life up to the point that he's at. And it's set in a fantasy world, but it's not too heavy fantasy. Beautiful writing. And the magic system is kind of believable and understandable in a way. It's almost like physics-based. And The Three-Body Problem. The Three-Body Problem is sci-fi. It's more of like a hard sci-fi though. I don't even want to tell you about the premise because when I was reading it, I didn't even know what the story was going to be about until it unraveled. So what are my 3 top nonfiction books that I read this year? How to Change Your Mind. That book was actually pretty big, but I still got through it relatively quickly because it was so interesting. If you're at all interested in psychedelics, medicine, or the nature of consciousness, I definitely recommend reading that book. They go into the history of LSD and mushrooms and how they've been used in clinical trials in the 60s up until today. The author tries mushrooms, LSD, and DMT, and he describes his experiences on those. All of what he has to say is well thought out, eloquent, and actually quite charming. The Selfish Gene. That book, if you are at all confused about evolution or interested in evolution, maybe you already have a good understanding of how it works, but you're just fascinated by it. That book, it was written in the 70s maybe, and it was an at the time revolutionary theory of a different correct way to view evolution. There's tons of information about habits of animals and game theory and the evolution of ideas or memes. And even though I just finished it a few days ago in 2020, I'm going to say Silent Spring for the third one. If you've at all ever been slightly in the back of your mind disconcerted about what pesticides do, that we cover everything in, what the potential ramifications of everything, of all life, are for using them, for eating them, for putting them on trees, water, in the air, check out that book. I'd like to say a lot has improved in the world of pesticides since it was written, but sadly I don't think that's true. So is there a biggest disappointment or maybe worst book I read? The worst book I read would definitely have to be Dune. People talk up Dune, and I don't even think it was its reputation that ruined it. Even if I read that book in a vacuum, I still don't think I would like it very much. You might disagree with this here, but I don't think it's a very good story. And I kind of hate the author's writing style. All of the vocabulary that, if you want to understand it, you'll have to constantly flip to the back of the book to see the dictionary. And the author is trying to give his main character foresights, which is a tricky thing to do in writing. With foreshadowing, you've got this weird valley that you're trying to avoid, you're trying to stay in the middle of, where on the one hand, you want to avoid explicitly telling your audience what's going to happen, or else they might lose interest in it because they already know. It doesn't really even seem like a plot anymore because you've told them the ending in the middle. Or you've got to be so obscure with all your foreshadowings that the main character's ability of foresights isn't even foresight anymore and it's just mystical nonsense. I don't think Dune does a good job at navigating that. And on top of that, there are very unsatisfying character transformations. The term Mary Sue gets thrown around a lot, like with Rey in the Star Wars movies, where she's some prodigious main character who never earned her abilities and just is born with natural talent that was never explained. That's how I feel about Paul Atreides in Dune. In the first chunk of the book, he's kind of annoying and a little bit useless. And then somewhere, he just becomes amazing at everything. He can just beat people in knife fights because he can foresee everything they're doing. And there's really no like, yeah, you earned that. I saw you work towards that. It's just like, boom, mind powers activated. I'm God. So I read the whole thing, trying to get something out of it, and I really didn't get much. And I don't think I got a return on the invested time I put into reading the book. Sorry if Dune is your favorite thing in the world, but it's not for me, I guess. Also, another one is Elements of Style. That book, like, everybody has to read for their journalism and media studies majors. It's a guidebook for how to write. It's not. You don't need it. It is not the kind of book that you read and gain lifelong benefit from. It's the kind of book that you have on hand at all times so you can reference. So there are the books that I read this year. They're the top 6 that I recommend you read. I usually try to find books that I will get something out of. I do a better job sometimes than others. Hopefully 2020 is an even better year for me for reading. I read 21 books last year. This year I want to read at least 30. See you next time. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video or any of my past ones, please share it with a friend, subscribe, whatever, and go read a book.